Good afternoon. My name's Jonathan Norman from the Major Projects Knowledge Hub, and I'm talking to Tim Podesta, who is an independent consultant, blogger and speaker with a passion for benchmarking. Tim, welcome.
Thank you, Jonathan.
So we're talking about all things benchmarking, and let's kick off there. Do you want to give me some examples for how benchmarking is being used in major projects?
So let me start with what I mean by benchmarking.
Very good.
And I like the term benchmarking because it has a bit of gravitas about it. The original benchmarks were scored on walls and on posts by surveyors to use as reference points for assessing levels. In today's context, a benchmark is something which can do three things in the context of major projects and other things indeed. It can provide a basis for continuous improvement as you sort of look to improve. It can also help you with an effective target setting, very important in the project environment. And thirdly, for me probably most importantly, it can foster a culture of sharing, of learning across an organisation, between organisations. So that would be my sort of basis for having a passion for benchmarking, which was really developed in my time with BP, where I was actually the benchmarking advisor, primarily on projects, major projects included, but also asked to give guidance on benchmarking generally across the organisation.
Good. So you gave us a quick and useful potted history of this idea of surveyors' marks.
Yeah.
Can you give me some examples for how it's been used more recently, perhaps looking at data and looking at major projects?
So some of my experience of benchmarking on projects, there's two types of benchmarking. There's the benchmarking of metrics, things like the cost, things like the schedule, the plan, things like benefits and outcomes. There's also the benchmarking of practices, project practices, and how projects are set up in terms of the planning that has been done, in terms of the team functionality, and it's possible to benchmark and measure those. And third area, complexity of projects linked to the risks behind a project. It's possible to benchmark those as well.
Right.
And I've seen all of those used effectively in a project environment to help both make sure we choose the right project and then set up the project so it's done right.
Okay. So one of the implications of this approach, assuming you're not just doing it internally, is that you need other organisations against whom you can benchmark and who will share some of their experience, some of their data with you.
So there are three levels from my experience in a large organisation. For the first level is probably the easiest. It's the project that you might have worked on before, or the project that's in the office next door within the same organisation, maybe it's a petrochemicals organisation or the upstream. The second level is when you're looking to benchmark within an organisation but across silos potentially. So for example in the upstream organisation you might want to be benchmarking projects, say LNG development projects in your region against those in another region.
Okay.
That's a little bit harder because you then have to effectively work across an organisation, although you're under the same umbrella.
Yes.
And the third area is when you look to compare data across organisations.
Right.
And there are a number of examples of where that's done. Third parties have set up organisations to help do that. There's a couple of examples, the Performance Forum, which has been active for 25 years. There's the Construction Industry Institute, which I have deep experience of working with, and they've done a number of research studies across industry, created some useful benchmarks as well. Right,
right. You talked about the gravitas associated with this word benchmarking. Do some organisations kind of struggle, perhaps because they don't recognise their benchmarking or because they see benchmarking as something different? I'm thinking of a number of ways in which organisations might already be using data or comparing data. Things like reference class forecasting, for example, which I guess would be a form of benchmarking.
Indeed, and so for me benchmarking is a way of describing an activity which has generally common understanding, but also because it has that sort of gravitas, and you can even relate it to sort of personal uses of data as well. it helps underpin the culture I described earlier, that culture of wanting to benchmark, wanting to share, and wanting to improve.
Good. We're talking about next generation benchmarking,
yes,
which sounds very grand.
Yes.
What's different about next generation benchmarking? Where is this taking us?
It's a challenge to my past. I presented on the subject of benchmarking, webinars and lectures, but the challenge I've had from the group of people that I've come across recently, and I'm embracing the challenge, is the impact of new technology, particularly data analytics.
Mm-hmm.
With access to data through various channels, various sources, what is the next generation for benchmarking, for using the data that can do even more in terms of helping us improve our projects, helping target setting, and fostering a culture of sharing.
What does that look like in practice?
So this is what I describe as a new space.
Right.
I've got some examples I'm starting to make inquiry into. And I was at a conference last week with Construction Excellence in the European Construction Institute, ECI. And in the room, one of the areas which we saw as a source of potential improvement for the industry, its profitability, its investment attractiveness and its productivity was technology.
Mm-hmm.
And what we came up with was, in our conversation, well, there's a number of things from data to drones.
Okay.
And so that's, for me, there's a whole number of things which have appeared in recent years where we could use that technology, those sources of data, to improve our projects under the banner of benchmarking.
Okay. You say we could use that. That suggests that there are some obstacles, some constraints to benchmarking?
So the constraints are probably as much mindset as in the practicalities.
Mm-hmm.
The mindset does require looking at things in different ways, particularly looking at data in different ways, and looking at how that data could be acquired. And then the big thing here is developing trust.
Right.
Both a trust in sharing, being able to share or pool data, I've heard it described, and also a trust in the insights which may be coming out of the analysis of that data.
Okay.
Particularly even in real time.
Right.
And on the other hand, the practicalities of having the tools, the technology available and piloted, and there is almost a trust in the technology investment, and there is a cost there.
Right.
And there may be an advantage for early adopters, or there may be, but there's certainly an advantage in being aware of what's available.
I think possibly one of the challenges for established organisations is the way that they are currently working.
Yes.
And moving towards these new ways of working. They may, particularly in the construction industry, they may struggle to find time to do this kind of thing, particularly if they're struggling with their margins and
yes.
everything's about delivering the project
yes.
rather than some of this more reflective work. And they may struggle with the issue of the quality of data and indeed sharing data. What's your sense for kind of baby steps forward? How do we start this process?
So that's a big question. I sensed that last week at the conference I was at. They wanted to really open the door for the industry as a whole.
Right.
Making sure all the stakeholders, particularly major contractors, there was certainly a feeling that major contractors both had potentially access to all this data.
Mm-hmm.
They use all this data as part of their bidding, but then they were under pressure from a time perspective and from a margin perspective as well. So it needed to be almost a collaboration, including owners as well as contractors as well as suppliers of technology.
Yes.
And the other answer to this is just raising awareness and encouraging the industry to try stuff.
Okay.
And there are three examples that, particularly in the context of benchmarking the next generation, I thought, well, there's three I've come across.
Okay.
And those are, in simple terms, the first one is deeper insight from the data.
Mm-hmm.
The second one is earlier intervention if there are issues which come up in a construction context. Technology can highlight that. And the third one is almost real-time advice and information coming from the use of data. For example, if you're creating a plan, a detailed plan, or updating a detailed plan, if there was a machine that had learnt from other plans, it could tell you as you created or modified a plan or updated the plan, it could tell you, well, there's this risk with that entry you've made, there's this benchmark against what you put in, and there's these gaps that you probably need to consider. So that's an area of real-time information coming out, and I think that those sort of things are possible today.
Right.
And then in terms of examples of the other areas, the early intervention, actually last week at the conference, one of the organisations presented a tool they were piloting, a robot in the form of a drone, which is effectively taking detailed images of a construction as it was being on a daily basis, or even sort of even more often than that, of progress. And it was almost the level of insight in terms of the data it was gathering and analysing. It was doing a QS, quantity review of what's been put in place, and almost immediately it was spotting gaps, which might have taken 2 weeks or a week to surface through other techniques.
So
that was a brilliant example, I thought, and it's early days for that, but that's something that's drones are more and more part, but that was a use of drones and data.
Yes.
And then in terms of my first area of interest around benchmarking, that's the deeper insight from the data. Now, one of the examples I present when I talk about data and benchmarking of project practices was the insight where a measure of complexity, more complex projects, less complex projects, added to that an analysis of the team functionality, whether it was strongly aligned or strongly functional or not. We identified that a weak team or a less functional team on a highly complex project, there was a function against the slip you'd have in that project. And over 20 projects, it was almost like a direct relationship. Now that was an encouraging insight from what I call a use of data in Excel.
Yes.
With deeper data, detailed plans, there are many other insights I'm convinced could be drawn out of that data in terms of linking risks to certain attributes on projects.
Yes.
And then linking to my example of creating and updating of plans.
Yes.
So there's a and someone described to me how some of these data mining tools work.
Yes.
Some of them are called worms.
Okay.
And what amazed me, the chap who was telling me about this was a lawyer.
Okay.
And I thought that's amazing. Someone in a legal environment is using these tools, but apparently they use it for forensic analysis of data when they're building cases for clients, for claims.
Yeah.
So you think, well, okay, what, that's an example. Why can't that be being used to do better plans?
Yes.
And then deliver better projects.
Yes.
So here I was being taught about new technology by a lawyer, almost an oxymoron, but there we go.
Yes. Well, one of the challenges across projects in general is large projects and complex projects are very influential, but in terms of the sheer number of projects, they're relatively few in number. And if you look at the construction industry, for example, a vast amount of construction involves much smaller projects. Is there a role for benchmarking on the construction of, I'm thinking one close to me, Wellesley? It's a new build between Aldershot and Farnborough, 4,000 new houses, a new school. Is there a role for benchmarking in that kind of environment as well as HS2 or Thames Tide?
Absolutely. When you look at benchmarking of a major project or a programme, one of the first things you do is you look at the objectives. What are the things that this project's trying to do? That gives you some clues as to what you might benchmark, particularly in the matter of outcomes.
Yes.
The next thing you do is you look at the components. what components you can benchmark.
Mm.
Now, buildings is an area where there's a lot of data on benchmarking.
Yes.
But then you might want to say, well, what type of buildings?
Right.
Schools, hospitals.
Yes. Yes.
And then you might say, well, as part of this program is roads.
Okay.
Or,
Yes.
or even tunnels.
Yes.
In a sense, benchmarking is a mindset.
Mm.
And the example I like to start with when I give my presentations, well, you can use it for professional objectives and personal.
Okay.
And my personal example, which is the one I share when I present, is around running.
Right.
And this fantastic activity called the Park Run.
Right. Yes.
Which I'm told, and is something that people who set it up believe strongly, it changes people's lives.
Mm.
It changes people's lives through being a fun event,
Yes.
a culture, but also it helps people with their targets
Mm.
and helps them improve through the simple use of data.
Right.
You
Right.
turn up with a barcode, you go to the internet,
Yes.
you do your run with
Yes.
lots of other people, community activity, and then at the end you get this email linked to a database and you've got all the records of all the park runs you've done.
Mm.
You can see people you're running with, you can see your age group, and the thing I like most is it gives you an age rated percentage.
Yes.
So even though I'm not running any faster than I did 5 years ago, it's telling me I'm 2 or 3% better than I was.
Just because you're getting older, basically.
Yes. So there we go. That's
Yes. Yeah.
it helps us with our reach our goals.